Welcome to In Other Words, the UCLA Tarjan Center's Plain Language podcast. In these podcasts, we interview our speakers from the Distinguished Lecture Series. I am Holly Oliver, the Disability Rights Advocate at the UCLA Tarjan Center, and I will be your host for this podcast. For more information, please visit our website, tarjancenter.org. It is spelled Tarjan center.org. I would like to welcome Dr. Samara Wolpe. Dr. Wolpe is a neuro-affirming autism researcher and clinician. Neuro-affirming care takes into account a person's neurodivergence and how their brain functions differently from the neurotypical norm. It celebrates those differences while still respecting struggles and providing assistance. Dr. Wolpe studies and supports the transition to adulthood for individuals on the autism spectrum. She helps autistic individuals develop skills for friendship, dating, and workplace relationships. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the PEERS Clinic, an evidence-based social skills program for youth and adults who struggle with social interactions. Her research focuses on improving the quality of life. She draws from lived experiences of autistic adults to help them reach their own adult goals. As somebody with autism who had difficulty transitioning into college from high school, I understood what that feeling is like. And I also know many people like me that haven't attended or completed college. I hope this changes. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Why is the transition to adulthood so difficult for autistic individuals?
That's a great question. I think to start with, it's worth acknowledging that it's difficult for everybody, right? It's never an easy transition. But I would say for autistic individuals, there are additional difficulties, there are additional barriers put in place during that transition. So, many autistic individuals who receive services in high school could be a variety of services. Usually those services are covered by government funding, by schools, and at age 18 or at age 22, if they have an extended conservatorship, all of those resources that they're getting just abruptly cut off. And there's not really a transition of, another system that's in place to cover the slack of those resources. So any therapies that they're receiving or coaching or any other assistive services are kind of just gone. And at the same time, they may be moving from the protective environment of a high school, which is a routine they're familiar with, where their parents can be very involved and supportive, to, the next stage of life, which could be, vocational school, college, employment. It could be, any of the natural next steps for adulthood. And those are all new environments. They're all much more unsupported than high school. And especially college or the workplace really require the individual themselves to sort of self-advocate for any services that they might need. So not only do they sort of face all the typical things that we all face when we transition into adulthood of increased independence in a new environment and not having, our parents to fall back on as much, but also they have to navigate sort of this thorny world of accessing services, dealing with disability offices, dealing with paperwork, disclosing to professors, disclosing to employers, all of that. So it's all the typical things that make transition to adulthood tough, plus all these extra things. In my study where I spoke to autistic adults about their experiences, one of them said to me that it felt like when they were younger, they were treated as younger than they really were. They were sort of infantilized. And they became an adult, suddenly they had more than average responsibility put on them because they had to navigate all these systems that they were unfamiliar with. So like the difference between childhood and adulthood was even bigger. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
I can see why this is so important. I wish they taught life skills in high school. They don't.
I wish that too.
Your research looked at barriers autistic individuals face and strategies for success. What did your research show us about the main barriers or things that prevent that success?
Yeah, so all of my research was focusing on what autistic individuals themselves felt were the main barriers for success. So from their experiences, we found a couple things. One of them was lack of financial literacy. So, I think this is just a big problem in the world that, most people aren't taught financial literacy, how to handle their finances, how to budget, how to pay bills. All that stuff is sort of like big and amorphous and or just like scary. I don't know, at least for me. So not really knowing about how to navigate finances is a huge thing. And that's often not taught to autistic individuals. I mean, it's not taught to anyone, but especially because autistic individuals may have to deal with more complicated financial situations because they're navigating like disability services, or they're trying to get like additional services. Some may try to apply for social security or disability benefits, which can be really complicated and confusing. So having not knowing how to navigate those financial things can be a really big barrier, because if you don't know how to navigate them, then you can't get the services, and money becomes a big problem. Another big thing that came up was autistic adults saying that they were constantly being infantilized, even as adults. So, like, treated like younger than they were, not assumed to be capable of what they're capable of. So, people just constantly underestimating them. And then, along with that, kind of treating them with indifference, or like not really caring to support whatever accommodations they needed. So this combination of being treated as like a child when they were adults, and also just being ignored. So those two things were like a huge barrier to success, because they felt like their contributions weren't being valued, but also they weren't set up for success in the workplace because their accommodations were being ignored.
And I still don't understand, why would they ignore accommodations when accommodations help me graduate through college, and I'm at a place where they're being very accommodating towards me. What works or is the most helpful for this transition?
I think there are a couple things. The biggest thing that came up was self acceptance and unlearning sort of internalized ableism. So, a lot of the people I talked to talked about how when they were growing up, they felt this stigma from the world, and that became part of how they saw themselves, of being a part of the disability community being a negative thing. And so, growing up and becoming more accepting of themselves and celebrating their strengths and their passions, and part of that was finding neurodivergent community. So finding community in other autistic people who they admire, who they look up to, and they can sort of have as positive role models, as people they respect and value, because it's so hard to have a positive self-image if you never see any positive representation of people like you. So I think that was really big for a lot of my participants, as well as taking time to really discover what their passions were and trying to build a career around things that interested them. And sometimes taking alternative pathways to do that. So, not always going directly to a 4-year college, maybe taking a couple gap years, or going to community college and then transferring, or going to vocational school, but maybe not doing like the typical 4-year path. So, I would say those are the things that stood out the most, but there are definitely other things as well.
That's very helpful as somebody who went through community college before I went into 4-year school.
Yeah. How was your experience with community college?
It was mostly good. I think what's important is that people research who their professors are and research the reviews and things like that, and also be able to email or contact those people to make sure that they are accommodating, and also make sure they have a reasonable DRC at that school that can work with them with the accommodations they need. I know for me, I had to go to DRC office and take my test so I could have extra time on the test, and somebody would read them and proctor them for me, because I couldn't sit still in the whole class with a bunch of other students. Well, it was hard for me to concentrate, but also they were able to enlarge the font on some of the questions too, so that they could be read out loud, and I didn't have to use the bubble sheets. I could circle the answers. That worked really well.
Thank you for sharing that. I feel like that's what I've heard from a lot of people in
Mhm.
the community, that community colleges were able to support them and able to provide them with accommodations, and that it worked much better than it worked at 4-year universities, which tend to be larger, kind of more faceless, because you never like go in and talk to people. You have less of a connection with your professors, so it's more difficult to get those kind of supports. So I'm glad you had a good experience. And that's what I've heard from a lot of people, that community college was a really positive experience for them.
So, how can the high schools better prepare students for the transition to adulthoods when those services end?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways that they can do that. One of them, kind of going back to the barriers, is teaching financial literacy. So teaching how to budget, how to pay bills, how to do all that stuff. I think that would be so helpful for a lot of people who felt like they were kind of just dumped into the deep end of the pool in adulthood, where they were like, I have no idea how to navigate this. Like, I have no idea how to pay bills, budget, all that stuff. And also to prepare them for, like, how do you request accommodations at college, like step by step. Where is the disability office? How do you go in there? What are you supposed to say? Like actually walking people through that step by step, so when they get there they're prepared, I think would be so huge for people, so they don't have to figure that out on the spot their first day of school. And also focusing on psychoeducation for families. So a lot of autistic young adults in my study shared that, like, their families didn't really know anything about neurodiversity, didn't really have any idea of their strengths or how to teach them about self-acceptance, self-celebration, how they what their strengths were, what their passions were. And so teaching families about neurodiversity, about their children's strengths, was something that came up a lot that high schools could do, even just providing like resources on their websites to neurodiversity resources of education.
I agree. What would an inclusive college or workplace look like?
For starters, accommodations would be honored and
Yeah.
respected, ideally. But more than that, accommodations would be easy to get, so they wouldn't necessarily require documentation and paperwork. You would just walk in and say, I need this accommodation, and it would be given to you without having to prove that you need it. Additionally, I've heard people recommended from my study that they have a menu option of accommodations instead of having you request what you need. So they would give you like a list of all the accommodations they offer, and you would just circle the ones you need, as opposed to having to come up with what you would need on your own. Another big thing is psychoeducation on neurodiversity, on the autistic community for everyone. So employers, professors, coworkers, all of that, so that it's the pressure isn't on the autistic person to educate everyone.
Yeah,
Uh,
everybody needs a plain language guide of some kind, it seems.
Exactly. Yeah. Everyone needs a plain language guide. And it doesn't even have to be that complicated. Employers go through so many trainings, just like have that be one of the trainings, right? Neurodiversity training. It could be like a pretty easy job requirement for people that would make a really big difference. And then the last thing that people brought up was that a lot of the participants in my study said that they would often bring up ideas for their workplace about how to improve things, about how to make them better. And their bosses would kind of shut them down, not because they weren't good ideas, but because it just wasn't how things were done. And that's kind of what is so wonderful and valuable about neurodiversity in the workplace, is that different minds are going to think of different wonderful ideas that wouldn't be there otherwise. So valuing those contributions, not just having inclusive hiring practices so that you can say you have inclusive hiring practices, but actually valuing the incredible potential that autistic people bring to the workplace and using their ideas.
I think so too. And I don't understand why they would label something inclusive when they're really not being considerate. They need to be considerate too.
I completely agree with you. Yeah.
In your view, what role should autistic voices play in shaping future research and policy?
I mean, hopefully they would be part of every step of shaping research and policy. I think they should be a part of coming up with ideas for research, participating in research, designing the research, writing the research, publicizing the research, and also reviewing the research. So, when we submit a research paper to a journal, there's always people who review it. I hope that autistic people will also be reviewing the papers so that we can, get feedback on that end as well. Also, I'll say that I'm not an expert in public policy. I'm more on the psychology side of things. But from what I understand, it seems like policy shifts come about with shifts in public opinion, right? And what shifts public opinion is people sharing their stories and representation, right? So representation in the media, representation in the public eye. So the more that there is accurate, respectful, genuine autistic representation, autistic actors playing autistic roles, autistic spokespeople, right? Actually being out in the public eye, the more policy will shift towards being more inclusive, more neuro-affirming. So I think that in addition to autistic people participating in research in every part of the research process, just representation is like the biggest and most important thing.
I believe that people with lived experience will make research and policy better, but also like it makes the research more vital, and also having their voices is just key. You can't just have some researcher making assumptions about it. It's better to have them be a part of it. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's already a shift towards that, but it's just starting, right? Like
Yeah, I
now
feel like I feel like it's still baby steps. Absolutely.
it's definitely still baby steps. There now, like more people are doing community advisory boards and things like that. But, ideally that would move to the point where that's just standard practice, where like
Mhm.
we don't do any research studies without autistic people being involved in the process.
Okay. If you could change one thing about the current support systems, what would make the most significant difference?
I think always public perception is the thing that matters the most in changing policy. So I would say neurodiversity psychoeducation for the broader public, because I think that's the best way really to increase acceptance and celebration of neurodivergent people. I don't know that anything else will be as important as just public consciousness being raised and changed.
This change is important. I hope this can be used more. And also, I agree. So many articles, resources are locked. Usually, like locked within a university, locked within like a database, and there's not enough like plain language versions. And even though people can look up advocacy groups, they can still get them mixed up with other things. So they need to do a better job narrowing it down so that they can find it more easily, because it's not always easy to find for some. I find that to be something we need to fix with accessibility. Well, speaking of that, resources, what are some books, articles, or websites that you think could help some of those that may need more information?
Yeah, I wish I had more accessible, fun, fun recommendations. But there aren't that many. There's a couple really great ones. So one that I really love is ASAN, which is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. They have great resources, great information. Also OAR, the Organization for Autism Research, they give out a lot of grants. They have great resources as well. The National Autistic Society has some great resources, but it's tough because a lot of these organizations kind of sound the same and can be confused with organizations that maybe have less great resources. So it's tough. I would rely on any self-advocacy network to direct you to where you should go, because you can trust that organizations like ASAN, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, will have checked out all the resources that they're giving you and make sure that they're neuro-affirming, accurate, accessible, all that.
I love both of those sources a lot myself. Okay, thank you again for speaking on In Other Words. You taught us that autistic individuals face many challenges after high school and need training in early life skills, inclusive environments, and understanding to support their independence and well being. You also taught us that more research is needed. Thank you again, and see you all next time.